folks, and welcome back. At this point, we are going to finish all the bony landmarks of the skull that have nothing to do with foramina. And then we will have video for the foramina. So where we want to go first are the paranasal sinuses. So para means on the side of. So these are sinuses on the side of the nasal cavity. And as you recall, the word sinus in reference to a bone is an air-filled space. It's going to be lined with an epithelium, so it's going to produce mucus and all that other stuff that you like to call snot. Okay, so we have 4 of these paranasal sinuses, which you can see in the drawing of the right side, where they have colored them differently. And so they are all hollow, and some of them are quite large, like the maxillary sinus, and some of them are quite small. If you were to pour a solid like plastic material in them, that would give you the structure on the left, where you can see the 4 paranasal sinuses plus something in purple, which is in your mastoid process that we're not learning about. So when we're done with this part, come back to this picture at the beginning and try to figure out which sinus is represented by the yellow, which one is the pink, which one is the green, and which one is the midline blue structure. So that's your clue. The blue one's in the midline, and all the others have a right and a left one. So let's get started. The first sinus is located in the frontal bone. And so if you are looking at a real skull cut in half, what you will notice, there's an air-filled space, and they can be quite large or they can be fairly small. And that explains why people often get sinus headaches in this area. The next bone that has a frontal sinus is your maxilla. And in fact, this whole area of your maxilla is hollow. As you can see the 2 pictures on the right, there's a huge maxillary sinus. Now, they did have to cut bone off for you to see this. It's not just like open to the outside. There's a small passageway which connects it to the nasal cavity. All of these sinuses have small passageways that connect them to the nasal cavity. But as you can see, this maxillary sinus on both the X-ray as well as a coronal section of an individual's head is quite large. Also note on that coronal section, you can see inferior and middle nasal concha quite clearly. That's kind of a cool picture. All right, the third sinus is in the sphenoid bone. So if you go back and find the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, the sinus is going to be right below it. And the sinus is sometimes represented as one large thing, but more commonly, it's kind of like 2 rooms with a connecting door between them. So sometimes, depending where the slice is, you will see it as 2 separate sinuses, always just inferior to the sella turcica. That's your clue, is sphenoid. Okay? Otherwise, it'll be represented as one larger sinus. And the 4th and final sinus belongs to the ethmoid bone, and it looks quite a bit different. So this one, instead of having one sphenoid sinus in the midline, for the ethmoid, we're back to, we've got stuff on the right and stuff on the left. And the sinus here looks much more like a honeycomb, you know, for the bees making the honey, where it's a whole bunch of little tiny rooms all put together, called, the entire thing is called the ethmoid sinus. And with that, we're done with the sinuses, but we have one last topic, and that has to do with how the bones of the skull join each other. So we have a specific type of articulation you'll learn about in lecture called a suture. And so all the sutures of the skull relate to the parietal bone. Okay, so don't start with the frontal bone, always figure out where you are in relationship to the parietal bone. So we have a right and left parietal bone, and between the 2, the suture is called the sagittal suture. Now notice it's not called the mid-sagittal suture because it's kind of a wavy line. It doesn't go exactly down the midline. Now, if you go between the two parietal bones and the frontal bone, then you have a suture that's in this plane, which is this plane. And what plane is that? That's right, it's the coronal plane. And that's why that suture is called the coronal suture. So you can see on the top of the skull, it's very much in the coronal plane. Laterally, it actually kind of angles slightly anteriorly. The next suture is going to be between the two parietal bones and the one occipital bone posteriorly, which, as you recall, was kind of an upside down V shape, and that's called the lambdoid suture. And I want to point out the spelling. It's lamb, L-A-M-B, and then there is a D, and then the oid. So a lot of students like to leave out that first D, so it's lambdoid suture. And this is a suture where it's very common to have those sutural bones in it. And so the picture on the right is showing a lot of sutural bones. Okay. And then the last suture is going to be between the parietal bone, and what bones haven't we talked about yet? Let me think, what bones? Oh, yes, those temporal bones, okay? And so this is called the squamous suture, spelled exactly like a squamous cell that you've learned about in lecture. So those are the sutures. So that's how it looks in an adult, but in a child, it's different. Because in a child, the skull bones have not completely formed, and so these sutures haven't happened, and so the skull bones can overlap slightly at the time of birth, which is a great thing for getting that baby out. And most of you know by now that those little babies have what we call soft spots in their skull. We have multiple ones, but we're going to talk about the biggest soft spot, which is right here between the parietal bones and the frontal bone, okay? And this has to do with how the skull bones are made. As you learn in lecture, they're made, the skull bone, the bones of the flat bones of the skull are made from a connective tissue membrane. And so that's what we're seeing here. It's where that connective tissue membrane is. And so this soft spot, each one is called a fontanelle. And so this large one between the parietal bones and the frontal bone is known as the anterior fontanelle. So now what I want to do is I just have a picture here which you can freeze on. And what you will notice is there are a lot of different bones in different colors. And as you are now done studying all your bones, try labeling all of these bones and figure out which one is which. And I will point out that, yes, this orange dot here in the eye socket, that is part of a bone. And so every color is representing a new bone. So that's just something you can do to see how well you did with your studying. And with that, we are done with this part of the lecture, and I will come back later and talk about the foramina of the skull. So thank you for